Good afternoon all. I would like to welcome you all on our third and final day of 12 student translation workshops. In a few minutes we will listen to a lecture on introducing translator studies delivered by Sir Andrew Chesterman, professor from University of Helsinki. So without much further ado, I would like you to join me in welcoming our guests.
As well. Thank you for the invitation. I have been exploring Krakow and meeting some interesting and lively people and having some interesting arguments too over the last 2 or 3 days. It's been a very wonderful experience. I hope it will not be my last to Krakow. This is what I want to talk about. I was asked to give some introductory ideas about translator studies. And when I looked at your program of the talks that you've been having in the last 2 or 3 days, using Google Translate to help my non-existent Polish, I discovered that you are actually already doing many of the things which would come under this heading. So I don't know how much of this, which I will say, will be obviously familiar to you, and maybe some things anyway will be new. I want to do 3 different things really. One is to give you an idea of the background, where this field, this new subfield started, and at one point I shall be embarrassed, as you will see. And then I want to give you 3 examples of the kind of work that can be done in this field, and why I think I will argue why I think it's significant. And then finally we will look at what conclusions we can draw. What are the pluses and minuses of this kind of research? And I will leave you with some references. And I think all these slides can be made available to anybody who wants them. If Magda or Joanna or somebody will distribute them, then you don't need to write everything down as I'm talking. So in some way or other, you can get the slides. Okay, so I will first start with one aspect of the background, which is something that I touched on Monday with the other talk, that some of you may have been there. So, but in case you were not there, you will probably already know that in the last 40 or 50 years or so, there have been a number of major developments. Some people call these turns in translation studies. And if you pick out 3 of these, this is really where translator studies seems to begin. First of all, chronologically speaking, there was the shift from looking at texts as texts to looking at texts in a cultural context, seeing translation as part of culture. So we began looking at ethics and ideologies and censorship and politics and a great many other things. And what this turn had in common was the idea of looking at translators as agents of cultural evolution or intercultural evolution. They have power, they have influence, they create change. They create difference and change. They are, of course, subject to constraints and limitations. As you may know, there has been a lot of work on how translators in politically difficult conditions cope with censorship. What do you do if you cannot publish what you want to publish, or you cannot translate what you want to translate, and so on? So they are not necessarily free agents. There are norms and there are laws and so on that restrict what an agent can do, a cultural agent. But at least they can do something. The second big turn started in the 1980s with a very influential German thesis which asked the question, what happens in the translator's head? We are now not looking at the texts themselves, but we are trying to find ways of getting access to how the translator makes decisions, how a translator's emotions affect the decisions that translators make, what you feel about your job, what your attitudes are to the norms under which you work. I mentioned just now the importance of these norms as constraints, limiting your freedom. But of course, you can have different attitudes to these constraints. You can decide to accept them, or you can decide to fight against them, or you can decide to try to change them, or whatever. They are not fixed. You can affect them, you can influence them. Some of the work in this area deals with personality, and I will give an example of this a bit later. And some people have begun to talk about the idea of a telos, which is an idea I quite like. You may have met the term skopos, which has to do with the function of a translation. What's the translation supposed to do to sell something or whatever it might be? Some scholars have begun have added to this the idea of a telos, which is something like the translator's personal subjective motivation to do what he or she is doing. Of course, your main telos is to stay alive and pay the rent and so on, but there are other ideological reasons why you might choose to translate a certain text or a certain text in a certain way. So here we are not so much thinking of translators as agents of evolution, but agents as real people who have thoughts even, and maybe even feelings. Wow, revolutionary. And then the third turn is the most recent one. People have begun to talk very explicitly about the sociology of translation. That term actually goes back to James Holmes in the 1970s, but it's not until the last 10 years or so that research has been more structured, where people have really started focus on the sociology of translation. And here we are looking at the behavior of individuals in groups or teams and networks and so on. So we are moving away from the idea that the translator is just one person, a single translator. We're more interested in the way the translator reacts with other people. Maybe it's a team translation, maybe there are terminologists and revisers, and maybe you're working in an agency. There may be all kinds of contexts in which you are not actually working alone, but you're working with groups of other people. And so people start looking at their status of translation, their different translators, their working processes, their conditions, how they relate to technology, their habitus, their personality, and this kind of thing, how your general behavior affects the way you act. So now you are looking at translators as social agents. Quite a lot of the work here deals with gender. Do I have the microphone too close? Too close? All right. Some of this has to do with the public discourse of translation, which means the view that the general public has of what translators do and what their work is. Sometimes the general public has a view which is very different from the view of scholars. All these turns focus on people and not texts. And in 2009, I published an article which I think most of you have now read, where I related this new field of what I call translator studies to James Holmes's famous map. And I suggested that there were actually these three main branches within translator studies: cultural, cognitive, and sociological. And now I have to be embarrassed, because I have since discovered that 5 years before I thought I had invented this idea, the Chinese scholar, Zhengcheng Hu, published in 2004 an article dealing with translator-centered translation research. And in that article, he uses the expression translator studies, which really annoyed me. because I thought I had found it first. Well, I'm wrong. He has since then gone on to be one of the founding members of what is called eco-translatology, which is a kind of Darwinian theory of translation studies, which is not really so connected to translatorial studies, but still. I give you the reference at the end on the last slide. If you want to go and check out his paper, you're welcome to do so. So I have to acknowledge that he got there first. So the first part of that background has to do with the way translation studies in general has been shifting. And then the realization that there is a slice of translation studies, which doesn't deal with texts, and we can group this as a separate sub-branch. Okay, the second main background factor that I want to discuss is, I think, really important, perhaps even more important, because it has to do with the reason why we would want to do this research in the first place. And this has to do with the move from descriptive research to explanatory research, from descriptive questions to explanatory questions. If we have a descriptive question, we simply want to ask, what does this translator do? What has this translator done? What is this text like? What profile features does it have? How can we describe it linguistically? What are the relations between this text and the source text? That's all textual based, but it's descriptive. And we can describe what translators do without moving into explanation. But as soon as you do move into explanation, it gets much more interesting. If you ask, why did this translator do this? Why is this text like this? Why did this translator decide to translate in this way? Why did the translator make this decision at all? Then it takes you out of the text automatically into the world beyond the text. And this is where you see, I think, the important connection between studies of texts and studies of people. After all, texts are produced by people. And if you want to understand why a text is the way it is, you have first of all to look into the person's head who wrote the text. What has happened in the translator's mind? Why did the translator think like that? This means that we can begin thinking of causality. And here we go a little bit into the philosophy of science, where the whole idea of causality, of course, is very important. However, as soon as you start looking for causality in human behavior, it's obvious that we cannot understand causality in the same kind of strict way as it is used in the natural sciences. So we have to have a much looser idea as to the way we understand causes. On Monday, I showed something like this rough chain of causal factors in translation studies. And if you look at the middle here, you have a translation where we could start. And if you say, why is this translation like this? You have to go back up the chain. You look inside the translator's head. You look further back into the sociological conditions. How was he working? What kind of dictionaries did he use? Who was his boss like? How much time did he have, etc. And then you can go beyond that to cultural factors. What is the status of translation in this society at this time? Why did he have those working conditions? And so on. And then you can also look at the effects of the translation. How does it cause something else? Well, it may have causes on the way people think and feel. It may even have effects on how the translator or the interpreter feels and thinks. I understood that Magda was saying the other day, talking about some of this kind of work, the traumatic experiences of wartime interpreting. This is a reference that I will give at the end, where Karl Mayer talks about the traumatic experiences of people who have had to interpret in Guantanamo, and how they really come out feeling so stressed that they need assistance, they need professional assistance, just because they've been interpreting these awful stories about people being tortured and so on. So translations and interpretations have effects on the people who do it, not only on other people. And then sociological and cultural and so on. I want to remind you here of Aristotle's classification of main kinds of cause, because I think that these are very relevant to the way in which we can use translator studies in order to try to explain why a text is as it is. Aristotle's examples have to do with a statue. He asks the question, why is this Greek statue like it is? And he says there are four main causes why it is like it is. Perhaps this is familiar to some of you, so I will go a bit quickly here. So first of all, the cause is, well, it's like it is because of what it's made of. This is made of marble, this statue, so that's one reason why it looks like it is. Well, translations are made of language, and sometimes, of course, pictures and diagrams too, but let's keep it simple. Let's just say language. So it's partly made out of the target language, that's the material from which it is made, and of course it's partly made out of the source text and how that influences what goes into the target language. Aristotle's second cause was formal. It's like this, the statue, because this is the way we do statues in Greece today. We have a chap like this, you know, he's throwing a discus, or we have a lady with only one arm or something like this, and this is the way statues are today. No, I'm not being too serious there, it's okay. Well, in translation studies, we have norms, of course, which tell you a translation is something which should look like this. If your translation does not look like this, it's not a translation, or at least not a very good translation. Then there is what Aristotle called the final cause, the purpose. What is the statue for? And we have the skopos idea, or the purpose idea. And finally, there is what Aristotle called the efficient cause. It's like this because it was made by my friend Fred, or Fredos. Let's give him his Greek name. He always does statues like this. It's part of his personal style to have statues, and you recognize that this is a Fredos statue. So the translator, him or herself, has an effect on the final shape of the statue. There's another way of explaining too, which I think I want to just mention briefly, which is explaining via putting something in the context. This is not causal. That's the important thing. In the humanities, I think we use these contextualizing sorts of explanations often. It's the kind of thing that you often find in historical research. That is to say that if you fit what you want to explain into a wider context of people or ideas or history or traditions or whatever it is, then maybe it makes sense better. Even if you cannot point to specific causes, you can see that it's not surprising that it's like this if you look at the context in which it was made. If you think, well, there might be influences, there might be causes, yes, but it's not so clear as in the natural sciences. One classic example is Darwin's idea of putting everything together under a single kind of context that he called natural selection. But in the humanities, we can talk about the way we use myths and narratives in order to create sense, a kind of wider contextual sense of how something came to be made. And so we have different kinds of models which try to suggest contextualization in order to explain in this perhaps looser way. Now I'm going to give you 3 examples of this kind of research, and I'll spend a little time on each before coming to the conclusions. The first example is what has come to be known as transfiction. I don't know whether that term is familiar to you, but I do notice that 1 or 2 of the papers, I think, if I understood correctly, seem to deal with transfiction. I think the classic source here is the book edited by Kindle and Spitzel dealing with transfiction as a new idea. That is to say the fictional representation of translators and interpreters in novels and plays, and maybe poems too. This is partly sociological and partly cultural, I think. It's kind of on the border between these two. It has to do with trying to understand the public image of translators and interpreters, because the people that write about them in these fictional works are not translation scholars, they are novelists or dramatists, they are not professional academics. So they have a naive view, you might say, of what a translator does or what an interpreter does. So this is interesting from the point of view of the cultural image and status of translation, and perhaps also sociologically, what kind of people do they think we are? So research in this area looks, for example, at identity. There are strange novels which play with linguistics, linguistic features, in order to show that the identity of an interpreter is very strange. I remember once reading the first paragraph of a novel by Christina Brooks Rose, which had no occurrence of the verb to be. The whole paragraph was written without the verb to be, or any form of the verb to be. And the point was that interpreters are never in that state. They are always between, and they never are anything. That was her way of describing this. I thought that was quite impressive. So you can look at characterization in these fictional works and so on. Or the function of symbolic or metaphorical functions, and even metafiction. Have any of you read Borges's work? Pierre Menard, some of you probably have. It's a really very strange thing about a man who decides to rewrite Don Quixote using exactly the same words as the original, but of course they all mean something different because we are now 500 years later or whatever it is and so on. It's quite extraordinary and quite fascinating. I'll give you an example in a minute, not of that, but of something that I want to talk about. And some scholars have looked at the relation between fiction and reality. Do interpreters really work like this? Or is this a betrayal of the real life of an interpreter or an interpreter, or a translator? The example I want to talk about is John le Carré's thriller, The Mission Song. Has anybody read it? I recommend it. It's a very strange and interesting novel. It was written 2 years after an attempted coup in Africa, led by some very nasty British and American people, and they failed to succeed in their coup. There is a historical background behind this in order to get the right to mine diamonds and so on and so forth. Corruption. That's the cover. And you will notice the zebra.
No, but we know the Polish translator of the university.
All right.
Unfortunately, he's not here. He's not here.
Oh, okay. How interesting. I have not read it in Polish, but I have read it in English. Okay. So the zebra. Why the zebra? Because the zebra, of course, is black and white. He's neither one thing nor another. He's between the two. He's got stripes. And the main character is known as the pretty little zebra in this novel, because the people concerned are not quite sure whose side he's on. Let me tell you a little bit about him and about the novel, and then we will see how this could be used to shed light on what le Carré thinks interpreters do. The narrator of the novel is the interpreter. He is the main character. And he's called Bruno Salvador. Bruno, he who saves. Okay, Salvador, you get this symbolic significance. And he has a mixed parentage, of course, like all good interpreters have. They have 3 or 4 different nationalities, all somehow in the family, in the background. He has been very highly educated, both in Africa, in the Congo. He speaks English, French, and Swahili, and a lot of other African languages. And he's been trained finally at the London, at SOAS in London. So he has a about the highest academic training you can get. He's very professional. And he speaks perfect English and perfect French and perfect Swahili and all various other things. But the other things are important. And he becomes a top interpreter with British intelligence. And he's very loyal to the British government and the British nation, although he is often made to interpret in situations which are not entirely ethically reasonable. I put that very carefully. And he also does work free in order perhaps to salvage his conscience a bit. He's very proud of his skills. He's very, very self-conscious. He can place people by their accents. If they open their mouth, he will guess where you come from in England or what part of Africa you come from if you speak Swahili. And he's very good about having what he calls his third ear. Now, I'm not an interpreter, and I don't know whether this is an idea that Le Carré has taken from real life or whether this is Le Carré's invention. The idea here is that this interpreter has this ability to listen to confused conversations which are taking place in a mixture of 2 or 3 languages, and the interpreter can make sense of it. He has what he calls his third ear, which has the ability to understand what's going on in a confused multilingual conversation. He's also very proud of himself. I quite like this quotation. This is the narrator, the interpreter, talking to the reader, you could say. Can you see it over there? You probably can't, can you? Or can you? I'll read it aloud because you can't see it. Okay. Never mistake, please, your mere translator for your top interpreter. This makes me feel very humble. I mean, I'm certainly not an interpreter, but I have done some translation. An interpreter is a translator, true, but not the other way around. A translator can be anyone with half a language skill and a dictionary and a desk to sit at. Is this how you translators feel? Your top interpreter, on the other hand, has to think as fast as a numbers boy in a coloured jacket buying financial futures. These are the people on the floor of the stock exchange doing this with their fingers. And 5 million get bought or sold in a minute. Maybe you've seen that on television. Better sometimes if he doesn't think at all, but orders the spinning cogs on both sides of his head to mesh together and then sits back and waits to see what pours out of his mouth. Very curious. It's as if he's no longer quite conscious of what he's doing. Those of you who have done interpreting, is this a familiar feeling? That you don't know how you do it, but somehow something is happening. English is coming here and Polish is coming out there. And I don't know how I do it, but it just seems to happen and I can't control it. There it goes. I haven't quite had that experience because I haven't interpreted, but maybe some of you have. So he's very proud and he's very concerned with his own skills. He's very aware of his own skills. Okay, then comes the plot thickens and he gets recruited to a special service, which is what they call the sound thieves. And I suppose there must be many professional sound thieves in the world whose job it is to work for their government, sitting to radio broadcasts from the enemy and interpreting the secret radio broadcasts which have been bugged from hotel rooms around the world or wherever it might be. You can imagine it. I'm sure this goes on. I don't have any personal experience. So he becomes a specialist in listening to this bugged talk, the secret talk that comes through an earphone, and you hear people talking about some plan to assassinate somebody else in a room in some strange language. And then off he goes on a secret assignment. And his job is to interpret these negotiations in English, French, and Swahili. This has to do with, we learn later that this has to do with an attempt by the British and the Americans to exploit local tribal chiefs and get diamonds and so on. But his job is also to listen in his other language during the breaks and not show that he also speaks the other languages. And this is crucial. Okay? It's very hard to pretend that you don't understand if you do understand. So Bruno Salvador has French, English and Swahili. This is how he makes his living. But he also speaks about 6 different other Congolese languages, the names of which I don't even remember. But he must not show that he understands these languages. You can imagine he's going to have problems because somebody suspects at some point that he does understand and says something quickly in this other language, and he responds and realizes, oh shit, I shouldn't have responded because now I show that I understand. And it gets very, very complicated. Do read the novel. I won't spoil it for you. Okay. Here is another example, and I don't know if this is invented by Carré or if this is true. I would love to know how Carré researched this novel. How much of it is his imagination? How much of it is simply his knowledge of the way interpreters work? Because this had not occurred to me at all. He says, if you are an interpreter, at the beginning of a session, it's a conference, say, and you're sitting around the table, and you're sitting here and it says interpreter. It doesn't even give your name, it just says interprète, interpreter on the front, on the card. And apparently, professional interpreters know that they should not begin by making eye contact with any member of the audience. Because if you do that, then immediately the audience suspects that you are not neutral. And so he has this little trick of finding a bottle of water and focusing on the bottle of water rather than somebody. Now, I didn't know that. I wonder, is that what you're taught? I don't know. One of the delegates asks, which are you? Are you one of us or one of them? When one side begins to suspect that he may be not neutral. And so he replies, Mwangaza, I am one of both of you. And everybody laughs, and he has solved the problem by being tactful and diplomatic. He is in fact working for the British, but he must not show this. He's also aware that his personality shifts as the language changes. He says, I become what I render. I become the language that I interpret into. Now this seems to me to be something which is not specific to interpreting. When I moved to Finland 50 years ago to live, and I learned Finnish, I became quite conscious of the fact that I was also somehow developing a different kind of personality in Finnish, and I'm sure that's a feeling that you all must share since you all speak a lot more than just one language. I don't think I get schizophrenic about this, but I do think I have a different aspect of my personality if I switch languages. I can see people nodding. This is very curious, is it not? I don't know how much this has been researched. I have not read any research on this topic, but maybe it has. I think it would be very interesting to give people personality tests in their different languages to see if they ended up with a different profile. There's a doctoral research project for somebody. You heard it here first. Maybe. Okay. So, during the course of the novel, our hero overhears from one of these bugged rooms in the interval, there's a conversation going on, and he realizes that one of the African chiefs, or the warlords, is actually being tortured by another African group. And the speech is all in one of these other languages, which he is supposed not to understand, but he does understand it. So he now has the ethical problem. Should I speak up and say what I know, and should I make this torture public, or should I not? And what you have here is an issue which has been quite seriously discussed in research in the last 10 years or so, having to do with ethics. And I don't suppose Le Carré has read any of these doctoral theses or whatever, but he's clearly realized that there is a problem here. What do you do as an interpreter, and perhaps to less extent as a translator? I think it mostly affects interpreters. When your personal ethics clash with your professional ethics, what wins? Do you do what you think you ought to do as a human being, or do you do what your professional training says you have to do? For example, in this case, remain entirely neutral. Do not betray the fact. Do not show that you know that there's been torture going on in that room, and you have realized that this whole conference actually is an attempted coup? Should you show that or not? As a human being, yes. As an interpreter, no. Eventually he acts. But I don't think I'm going to tell you what happens, but I think you ought to read it. You ought to see what happens, right? What? No, I'm not going to tell you. No, read it. It's a good story. Okay. I think that novel, that thriller, really picks out several aspects of what seemed to me to be a real interpreter's life, which are ethically very hard indeed. Even listening when you're not supposed to be listening. Eavesdropping, you know the expression? You overhear somebody else's conversation and they don't want you to overhear it. These are quite interesting issues. When Finland entered the European Union in the 1995 or so, Finland became one of the languages, one of the official languages, obviously. And I got to know some of the people who were going to work there. I helped to train them. And one of the things I realized was that as an English speaker, you are at a disadvantage in the EU negotiations. Because if the negotiations are in English, as they often are in these committees, and you are an English person, you probably don't speak any other language very well. You're probably more or less monolingual. Not entirely. I guess many people speak French and German, but there would be people there who are only happy talking in English because everybody speaks English, etc. You know the myth. So they do not have a secret language, a private language. But if you're a Finnish negotiator and you're negotiating in English, you can go switch into Finnish at some point and chat to your friends maybe in the coffee break in Finnish, and you can be very sure that nobody will understand a word. And perhaps the same is true of Polish. So these are interesting ethical issues, and I found the novel intriguing from this point of view, the various ethical issues it raises about an interpreter's life. It's very revealing. I recommend it. It's a fine story. The end is on the one hand sad, but on the one hand optimistic, and I will say no more. Okay, example 2. It's a typical Le Carré ending, I have to say, because... oh, no, no, don't say anymore. I won't say anymore. Okay. But basically, the English upper classes are all bastards. I mean, I expect you know that anyway. But, okay, enough of that one. Now, second example. Translation ergonomics. I mentioned this briefly on Monday, and people didn't always seem to take it seriously, but I want to show that it can be taken seriously. Because this goes back to the way in which whole concepts of quality have expanded. I think this is a good example of the way in which translator research has had an influence on textual research. If you look at quality from an ethical position, not just a textual position, so that you're not just measuring equivalence, and you're not just studying how natural the language is of the translation itself. But if you are now looking at the quality of the working conditions and the way the translator is treated, you are actually expanding the sense of quality to include different parts of the environment in which the translator works. And this is partly interesting in itself, and it partly maybe gives you reasons to explain why the quality of the text was the way it was. One of the examples that I found very convincing about this sort of work was a study dealing with a subtitling of a Hollywood film. And this was done by a group of translators. In this case, these are Finnish translators. The reference comes at the end of the paper, but you don't need that at the moment. So the translators work and they translate the subtitles, and the film directors or director is very unsatisfied with the quality of the translation, and he complains. And in fact, it's not very good textually. It really is not good. But then it becomes clear that for reasons of copyright, as it were, as the translators were translating the subtitles, they didn't see anything except the text, the original text. They had the manuscripts of the words used. But they saw none of the film itself because of the fear that they might pirate it or video it or something, and clearly they were not trusted by the producer. So they had to translate in the dark, which was one reason why the textual quality of their work was very poor. But they said, it's not our fault, we are given unacceptable working conditions. Ethically, you could say, well, they were stupid to accept these conditions. They could have said, no, I'm not doing this work unless we are able to see the film, in which case they lose their money and so on, and somebody else does it, and it's even worse, I suppose. But this is an example which revealed to me how important it is to take account of the environmental factors, the working condition factors, when looking at quality in a broader way. I think this is extremely sensible. You could also bear in mind deadlines. How much time do you have? What resources do you have? What kind of backup do you have? What kind of technical resources or terminological resources are available to you? How much are you being paid? All this has to do with how much risk you are prepared to take. You are investing your effort. You as an interpreter are investing effort. And if you think that the risk is not worth it because you're not being paid very much or because the conditions are terrible, then you will not try very hard. You will not make a big effort. You will not invest much effort. So this puts the responsibility on the employer, on the translation agency, if you're working for an agency. If they want good quality, they have to invest in working conditions. And there are other things too, such as what kind of chair you have, what kind of light, the screen display, the quality of the air, that can have an effect. How you use translation memory, how do you prevent your eyes from getting tired if you're working on the screen? Maybe you suffered from this RSI, these repetitive strain injuries. You know, when you get that, if you're working with the computer for 8 hours a day or something, you get pain in your wrist and in your elbow, and it's very unpleasant. You have to rest. All these things may affect the quality of what you do. Basically then, we're dealing with what's called cognitive friction, which is a new term which I quite like. And the idea is that you are looking at how your cognition gets disturbed when you are dealing with the interrelation between the human being and the machine. There's a quotation here which I will just read from a recent paper by Maureen Ahrensberger-Dow from the book that she edited. And she says this: translators work under tight temporal constraints in an increasingly technologized environment. Many work in offices that may not be designed for intensive text work, and within organizational systems that do not suit their cognitive and informational needs. So these chapters illustrate, I will now skip a bit, how ergonomic issues at tractors' workplaces can have an impact on the efficiency of the process and the quality of the product, and how they could affect professional identity. These are quite big issues. They are really sociological as well as cognitive, and I applaud this kind of research, certainly. My last example has to do with research on personality. I'm not going to go into that in a psychological way, but I want to give you an example, a kind of case study example. Because it seems to me that the more you know about a translator's personality, the more you can make sense of that translator's style. I was very interested yesterday to meet Antonia Lloyd-Jones, whom I had not met before, although I know her name. But she wasn't a personality to me before I met her. Now she is a personality. And I look forward to reading her translations with this in mind now. I'm going to give you an example of Douglas Hofstadter. Does the name ring a bell? Anybody? Anybody read his book? One or two people have. It's a most extraordinary book, but I want to focus now on one particular translation which he's done. He is, in fact, a professor of cognitive science in America, and he lists his research interests as these. So he's interested in human thought, and especially analogy making, creativity in general, discovery in mathematics and physics, literary translation, and the philosophy of mind and consciousness. He's not a narrow-minded guy, right? It's more or less the whole world he's interested in. He's a very interesting character indeed. The more I learn about him, the more fascinated I find him. I'm also interested in him because when his first book came out, which I will not talk about now, Le Tombeau de Marot, I wrote to him and I emailed him and I said, I found your book totally fascinating, but why don't you quote any translation scholarship, any translation studies research? Because the conclusions he comes to are very similar to our conclusions. And he wrote briefly back and said he's looked at translation scholarship, translation studies, and he finds it all far too boring. Oh well, I suppose I asked for that. Anyway, he's certainly not boring. He speaks several languages, and his home language at the moment is Italian. The first two books that made him famous were those two. The first one is not about translation, it's about analogy and creativity and patterns. He's fascinated by patterns. And the second book is about translation, but I will not talk about that here. He writes amusingly. So one of the chapters in this second book is how jolly the lot of an oligoglot. You are all oligoglots, but did you know that before now? In other words, you all speak several languages. You know what an oligarchy is? You are an oligoglot because you speak in several languages. And what fun you have, don't you, speaking your several languages? You have a jolly lot, a jolly fate, a jolly way of life. So he likes rhymes and jokes and patterns of all kinds. Now, one of his translations, he has translated some poetry, which the first book is about, and he's also translated 3 novels, 2 of which I have studied. And I'm going to talk about this one, which is Eugene Onegin, which his translation is published like this. So it's a novel in verse by Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, and the cover page says that this is a novel versification. So you've got novel in verse, novel versification, play, pun, joke, ha-ha. This is Hofstadter having fun by Douglas Hofstadter. Okay. Typically, the translation begins with a long translator's preface. In this case, 30 pages, where he talks about how he got into the novel and how he first began to read Eugene Onegin in 2 different translations in bed with his wife. It was their way of being together. No, perhaps not foreplay, but it was. They enjoyed reading the translations, and he got into it that way anyway. And there's a lot of very, very personal background on this. He did this translation after the death of his first wife, the sudden death of his first wife, and it appears that this work helped him to get over the death of his wife. It's very, very subjective, very personal. He sent the copies of his, bit by bit, he sent it to his aged mother, who commented on it and so on. The family's all involved, and his friends, and oh, heavens. It's very personal, very, very strange, and very interesting. It seems that the reason that he set out to translate the novel was because he wanted to possess it, like you might want to possess a woman if you're a man. I mean, it's like having power over this other person. It's like a kind of love relationship in some strange way. He began by learning different stanzas by heart, and then by translating them and comparing them with other translations and so on. He loves the rhyme scheme. If you've studied Pushkin, you will know that the rhyme scheme is really very complicated and very regular, with the masculine and feminine rhymes and so on. And what he does is he goes even further than Pushkin does in some cases, and makes even more patterns than Pushkin made. He overdoes it, in other words. He even puts in his own jokes. Here is an example. In the last line of the second stanza, we have Hofstadter's translation as the North was, shall I say, severe. And this is supposed to be a pun on the Russian word sever, meaning north. Maybe you know that because many of you know Russian. I don't. And Hofstadter, he likes being flippant. He likes making these stupid jokes because the other translation, which he compares with his own, is simply but found it noxious in the north. So that has noxious in the north. Noxious means poisonous, or not pleasant. But Hofstadter's line makes a bilingual joke out of it. And sometimes Hofstadter even does something that Pushkin doesn't do, which is to have a whole stanza beginning with the same letter. Every line begins with the same letter. Now, Pushkin never does that, but Hofstadter does. So he's taking Pushkin and pushing him even further into patterns and patterns and patterns. And now I think that he really shows that he hasn't read some of the linguistic research that would have been relevant to him. Hofstadter is not a translation scholar. He's really something different. He's a cognitive scientist who is fascinated by translation and has taught translation, verse translation, literary translation. He really seems to have the universe at his feet. But there are some things which he does not appreciate, and this is one point where I would criticize him. He copies all Pushkin's rhyme schemes, exactly. Masculine rhymes, feminine rhymes, and so on. And he adds some things to this. But he seems to me to be mistaken in assuming that if you take a particular stylistic feature from one language and you reproduce exactly this same stylistic feature in another language, in a translation, he seems to assume that the effect will be the same. And he doesn't realize that, in fact, different languages have different thresholds, shall we say, different tolerance of repeated rhymes of certain kinds or whatever. Russian and Italian find it very easy to rhyme. Other languages, like Finnish, find it much harder to rhyme because the words are longer and they don't have this repetitive structure in the same way. So repeated rhymes, repeated all the way through a stanza, would have a different effect. There would be a different level of what the language can tolerate. The rhetoric would be different. Kundera makes the same mistake. If you read Kundera's work on his own translation principles, why he accepts certain translations of his own work and doesn't, he has the same idea, which I think is a fallacy. Stylistic effects are not universal. They are language bound. They may be shared, but they're not universal, in my opinion. He hates Nabokov. He hates Nabokov's idea that you should translate literally, because when Nabokov translates, and when Nabokov translates Pushkin, it's all literal translation with 1 million footnotes, and every word is explained in great, great, great detail. And there is no attempt at all in Nabokov to respond to Pushkin's form. There is no pattern, no sense of pattern. For Hofstadter, pattern is everything. Pattern is the most important thing. In this preface, he also writes about his philosophy of translation. And this is one of the things he says about his philosophy of translation. Do you agree? I think this is nonsense. And he calls it poetic license. Get it? Get it? License? Yeah. Pun, right? Yeah, well done. Over here on the right, people are laughing, that's good. Okay, so one is always lying, for to translate is to lie. Garbage. This is nonsense. He's simply being provocative. He loves to be provocative. His personality is all over the page. Look at me, look at me, look at me, look what I can do, look what I can do. I can make patterns. But even to speak is to lie, no less. Is it? Could you bring me a coffee, please? Where's the lie? It's not, no lie there. No, I don't want another coffee now, it's okay. No word is perfect. Well, yes. Well, no sentence captures all the truth and only the truth. All we can do is make do, and in poetry, hope to do so gracefully. Well, you can see what he's getting at, but it's not lying. I think it's just silly. Okay. He has a very interesting discussion of why he is retranslating this novel. As you know, retranslation has become quite a pop topic in translation studies these days. A great deal has been written about it and about the problems of distinguishing a retranslation from a revision and so on. Do we need retranslations because the previous translations have got out of date? Well, why don't the originals go out of date, etc., etc., etc. He has a very different view on this, and here I do agree with him. Here I think he's doing something, he has an original thought, which is not nonsense. Why do people learn the piano when you can have professional pianists playing your works much better than you ever could? Why do people still want to climb Everest? Because it's been done. It's a good, and he said, well, I retranslate in order that I can try to emulate these other people. I want to have this experience too. I want the experience of translating this book. I want to know what it feels like to retranslate Pushkin. I don't care if my translation is not as good as the previous ones. Before Hofstadter, there have appeared in English about 8 translations, and he compares them all. He especially likes the Phelan one. He said, well, I want to be different from Phelan. Where Phelan is lyrical, I'm jazzy. Where he's legato, I'm staccato. Where he's flowing, I'm percussive. Where he's subtly seasoned, I'm saucy and spicy. He's putting his personality in this. He wants to be jazzy and staccato and percussive and saucy and spicy and provocative and so on and so on. And if you look at his translation, and I can see this even though I don't know the Russian, but I can see it by comparing his translation to Phelan's. I'll show you in a moment an example. He actually is translating much more freely than Phelan does. He draws attention to the language. It's not at all transparent glass, but stained glass. I can't imagine Hofstadter writing, wishing to be transparent. He wants you to look at the style, his own style. He wants you to see the stained glass as well as the original behind it. He wants to be visible. A bit like foreignization, maybe. But then he always writes like this. If you read his books and if you look at his homepage and the stuff you can find on the net, the whole thing is language play. He even gives a biography of his own life without using the letter E, because it makes a new pattern. It becomes a lipogram. Here is an example where you have Phelan's translation on the left and Hofstadter's on the right. Phelan, this is where Eugene Erguen comes to a ball. Our hero arrives at the ball, and there's all kinds of people dancing about and so on. Onegin arrives. So the neutral kind of translation is on the left. And on the right, you have Hofstadter's, which is bouncing about much more. But it's also got stuff in it which is really pretty ugly, I think. I find this line here really awful. Flashy bells, flash, fleshy feet. You can't even say it properly. It's a very ugly line. And indeed, one of the critics of his translation pointed precisely to this line and said, this is terrible. It's really terrible English. Hofstadter he makes patterns, but he has no ear for language, says the critic. Hofstadter didn't like this criticism and immediately wrote back to the journal in which this criticism had been published and wrote a reply in the form of a Pushkin stanza with the right number of lines and the right number of rhymes, making fun of this awful critic and just picking out these occasional nasty lines. He won't take criticism lying down. He wants to reply immediately. So you've got quite a lot on the right. This is a language of the language that Hofstadter uses is much more colourful. It makes you look at the language. Look at the last couple of lines. The fiddles, the violins, scratch soon subverts the fickle chit-chat of the flirts. And you can feel the rather awful fiddling, the violinist going there. A whole different feeling to the way Phelan does it, where it sounds much smoother. So he's being more jazzy, he's playing more, and so on. Another example of the way he pushes his personality into the translation is this. One of the stanzas was cut by Pushkin, perhaps because of the censorship reasons, I'm not quite sure. And Phelan doesn't translate it. Would Hofstadter leave a gap? No, he wouldn't. Hofstadter leaps in and writes this. These last 6 lines are oft omitted, and therefore, by a fluke of fate, your translator, i.e. me, Hofstadter, can speculate. One hardly needs to be quick-witted to wonder if our author meant to hint that he himself's that gent, and so on. So Hofstadter dares to put his own verse in where Pushkin took one out. He loves these patterns. Do you see the pattern here? The preface starts with the words, my unclear, blah, 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 and it ends, Pushkin mine. The translation starts, my uncle, and you see the connection with the preface, the same letters, Onegin mine, because that's the way in which the original started. It started with moi, whatever the word is for whatever it was in Russian, I forget because I can't manage that. And it has the my and the my. The Pushkin begins with my and ends with my in different forms. The back of the book, the back cover, has this photograph. This is our hero, a slightly younger man at this time. He's in Pushkin's study in Moscow, or wherever it is, near Moscow, wherever Pushkin's place is, and he's sitting underneath Pushkin's portrait, actually translating the final stanza beneath the portrait of the author. So we have patterns within patterns within patterns within patterns. The translator is not hidden. The translator does not have anything like a kind of servile, mouse-like habitus. Yes, I will do what I'm told to do. I will follow all the norms and behave very quietly so that you don't notice I'm there at all. This is not Hofstadter. Are you beginning to get the point? I hope you are. So, what can we conclude? First of all, we can conclude, I think, that by expanding the methodology and looking at the personality and these other aspects and so on that I looked at in these 3 examples, you can learn quite a lot about what people think about translation and interpreting. And in this last case, I think by looking at Hofstadter's personality, you can understand why he translates the way he does. There is a clear connection between his other writing and his personality and the style he uses in his translations. So he doesn't keep to the author's style, nor does he in his translation of the French novel, which is another novel that he has translated. He doesn't keep to the style. He puts everything turns out to be Hofstadter's style. So we can expand the methodology. We can use different sorts of methodologies. I've done a kind of amateur psychology analysis of his personality, not very detailed, but to give you an idea, I think. We can use interviews and so on and so on and so on. We can use all these different sorts of research in order to try to explain or at least to suggest connections, correlations perhaps, loose correlations between the text itself, which I think is the core of our work, and all the background factors of various kinds to explain, to try to make sense, why is this text the way it is? I think that's perhaps one of the most interesting questions you can ask. Why is this translation the way it is? But there are questions that remain, where I think one of these questions is tricky. One of them we talked about on Monday with the group that came there. Does this mean that translation studies is simply breaking up? It's no longer one discipline, but it's breaking down into different fragments. Another question is, if we study the translators in the way in which I've illustrated and the way in which you've been talking about also in your own papers, so far as I understand, does this distract from the key issue of communicative quality? You could say that this is perhaps also something at the core of translation studies traditionally. We're interested in good communication across certain barriers, certain bridges. So if we study all these other things, are we losing sight of this sense of quality? And then there is this question, which I call the dentist problem, which was raised to me in a conversation by another scholar, Ernst August Gut, who is famous for his work on relevance theory. He doesn't like translator studies. He thinks it's a waste of time. It's a distraction. Why bother to do that? I said, well, because it's interesting and because it helps us learn more about what translations are like and so on. He said, does it? If you wanted to be a dentist, would you go and simply study what dentists do and look at their biographies and look at their working conditions and the chairs they sat in and their cultural significance and their cognitive processes and the fictional representations of dentists? If you wanted to be a dentist, would you? Well, no, maybe I wouldn't. If you want to be a dentist, you've got to learn about teeth and about what goes wrong with teeth and all the rest of it, right? So are we being distracted? And if you don't like dentists, then think of doctors or engineers or electricians. I mean, do we have doctorates on the cultural significance of famous electricians? Or, I don't know, do we? I don't think I know any. Is this simply interesting and fun, but distracting us from more important things? For Gut, he would say, yes, you are not focusing on what you should be focusing on. And that's where a question I will leave you. We probably have a few minutes for questions. What makes translators different from dentists? So that might be a good place to start. And there are the references, which you will have on the slides when you get them. Let me stop there and allow at least 15 minutes or so, or something like that, for questions. Sorry, I'll hold that up here. Sorry.
Right, so thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for an inspiring lecture. So I would like now to invite the audience maybe to ask questions or give us your thoughts and comments.
You probably have to use the mic if it's being streamed, otherwise the other people won't hear anything.
Thank you very much. I'm very curious about your thoughts on the relation between translators and machines. And I mean all types of machines. It's computer-aided translation, translating programs, translating machines like these devices, translators. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I only have a kind of observer's view of this because I've not done this sort of research, although I have talked to scholars who do this. And what I have learned is that it's becoming a more serious problem all the time because for some scholars, for some translators, machines are very helpful. I mean, we all use computers these days if we are translating, yes. But some people prefer to dictate. We were talking about this with Magda the other day, that if you dictate your version and then you edit it on the screen, does that affect the style? Are you actually going to end up with something which is more like spoken language? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that research has been done on that. I think it would be interesting to see. That might suit some people. But there are people who are superb translators, but who do not like machines and really want to continue working in more traditional methods. When Warsztaty was translating a French novel, La Chamade, it's called, he started off by writing out by hand, and he's a computer guy. I mean, he's really a computer expert. He wrote down every word, every sentence of the novel by hand on a big notebook, by handwriting, leaving a space between every line, and then went through and wrote a translation under every line by hand. That was his first stage. He said, I do this because I want to get the feel of the work, the feel of the language. And only after that did he go ahead and put it all on a computer, or maybe some secretary did that, I don't know. And then he edited it. But that was I thought that was very strange. He didn't do this one this way, but he did do this other translation in that way. And that seems to show a kind of suspicion that if you are a literary translator, then you are being distanced by the machine. The machine is somewhere between you and the work. And if you use your hand in the more old-fashioned way, then you are closer to the work itself. Then there are all these stress factors. But if you're not working with literature, if you're a professional translator working with technical texts or legal texts, then it seems to me you have to work with translation memories, because you save yourself 1 million hours of work if you can immediately access how things have been done before, and so on and so on. But it's a whole different skill. It's not a language skill at all. It's more like a technical skill. And you may have to learn that skill as something which is very foreign to you. Even though you may be a natural linguist, you may not be a natural computer buff. I'm not, certainly. So I think it's a serious area of research, and there's more and more being done about it. One of the first doctorates that I do remember on that subject was done by Barbara Dragstedt at the University of Copenhagen, and she showed that simply using a translation memory showed, if you looked at the translations that translators produced, and I think these were not literary texts but other texts, that the translator segmented the text differently. If you're working with what a machine gives you, so the machine translation gives you a suggestion immediately. You're saving time by using a machine translation. And it makes a suggestion. And it goes sentence by sentence, probably, because that's the way the machine would be programmed. But you, as a human translator, you might not actually want to work sentence by sentence at all. You might more like work with bigger or smaller units. I remember being amazed to hear the way in which Freud was first translated into English way back by a guy called Ernest Jones, who was also a psychoanalyst. And he said he worked by reading one whole paragraph of Freud and then putting the original on one side and then writing his own paragraph and then checking to see whether he'd forgotten anything. Now that's a very different kind of segment to the kind of things that a machine translation would force you to do. So the machine may be forcing you to think in ways that are not quite natural to you. That's one issue. Another issue is humanization or dehumanization. There is a feeling among some scholars, such as Anthony Pym, that the more we rely on machines, the more we are dehumanizing the whole profession. And here I think literary translation will become split from non-literary translation. I think literary translation will remain more traditional in this respect. Okay, some people will use voice recognition programs, but I think it's a lot of the other work will be done more and more by machines, and translators will more and more become post-editors and so on. So those of you in this room, I imagine, are largely interested in the literary side of things, and I think that will remain something less affected by machines than many other aspects of translation, different genre. What do you think? Why the laughter? I don't know. Do you have an answer to your own question?
I agree. But especially knowing some interpreters, and they are very anxious of this development which is going on. like replacing living interpreters with machines, especially with these small devices, some are, which are invented for English-Chinese communication.
Yes.
Yeah? So it's like, yeah, of course.
But if you've seen them working, they are actually quite impressive. I have a guy who has to use these machines because he has sight problems, and he will read something in his machine, and it will then you hear the Chinese voice saying it, or vice versa, which is quite impressive technology. But of course, it's not literature. No.
If we could come back for a second to your third example, Douglas Hofstadter, who is, I think, a fascinating and completely crazy person. We were commenting with Zosia that in Polish literature we have a similar character. Stanisław Barańczak was a brilliant translator, but also an oligoglot and somebody who really makes, lives in the wordplay. Towards the end of his life, he died 2 years ago. He was seriously ill. He had Parkinson's disease, and the beginning of the disease coincided with the very active phase in his translation of Shakespeare. He translated 25 plays by Shakespeare. He translated most of the English poetry tradition into Polish, as well as absurdist poetry from American tradition, lots of things. It's an enormous corpus of translated work. So I was researching recently a little tiny part of his archive, which is a correspondence he had with Czesław Miłosz, another Polish poet based in the United States. And he would send him his translations all the time, like every letter would have an attachment of. So I was thinking that once his archive opens, one could perhaps discover what is the relationship between the illness or the feeling that his life is going to be cut short very soon, and that he doesn't have time with this activity and this absolutely fantastic creativity of his translation work. He's also very creative and very unsubservient. But then, while listening to what you were talking about in the context of Hofstadter's work, I was wondering what possible questions or what possible effects of this kind of research we can arrive at. Is it, because you said you can see in Hofstadter's translation that actually his personality is reflected in it. Now the first question is, how do you measure personality, and what do you do to be more academic or professional about that? And the other question is this an ultimate conclusion, that you can see the personality or the illness or the life situation reflected in the translation itself, or do we want to see something else behind that? Is there a perspective of more general questions or more kind of, questions pertaining to the, anthropology of culture?
I think there are some general issues. I agree that if I pursue this line of study, I would clearly want then to do some kind of more precise personality analysis, but then it would be hard to do that without actually going to interview him and so on. I don't know whether he would like to have his personality analyzed. I don't know. But I think, for me, the eye-opening side of this little study that I did of his prefaces, I took some of the other ones too, this is just an extract from that, was the fact that it shows that the generalization that was made by Daniel Simeoni, about 15 years ago, that translators tend to have a servile or subservient habitus. He used this term habitus from Bourdieu, so he's taking it from sociology, and he was arguing that translators tend to feel that they are under the authority of the source text. Maybe he was thinking of holy texts, I don't know, like the Bible and so on, or literary texts, and that one of the generalizations he offered was that they had this shared feature. But I found this particular case study a very interesting counterexample. Clearly this is not necessarily the case. You can have a wild personality, such as the Polish guy you referred to. So there must be exceptions to this. So then one would want to know when does a translator tend to adopt a more servile habitus, and when does a translator have the kind of personality that is not servile? I didn't find Antonia at all servile, I must say, meeting her the last couple of days. She's obviously belongs to this side of the continuum. But and would you then say that for literary translation, that a certain source of personality would be more suited to translate certain sorts of texts than others, and so on? I don't know. I think the connection that I find interesting is the connection between personality and text, between the kind of person you are and what kind of text you write. So you can sometimes find out things quite trivial, which must lead somewhere. I remember somebody asking me what my favorite punctuation mark was, and I said, well, I've got two favorites. One is a semicolon, which I use a lot, more often than you should in Finnish, because Finnish doesn't use semicolons anything like as much as English does. And I like 3 dots, because 3 dots suggest that something is not finished and not complete. And then I ask another person, you know, what's your favorite punctuation mark? Oh, question, the question mark, always, says my wife, always. Always questions. Oh, no, never answers, always questions. And maybe even these little preferences, stylistic preferences, say something about the kind of language that you feel more at home with, or the way you write. So I'm interested in the connection between personality and style, you could say, and what kind of parallels can you draw? I don't think I quite call them correlations, because that sounds too statistical, but there are provocative thought-provoking connections, I think. And with Hofstadter's case, what you notice is that he has actually very little respect for many other aspects of the original author's style. He follows all the patterns, but in terms of lexical level, for example, degrees of formality or degrees of depth of the choice of lexis, he doesn't really pay that much attention at all. He's interested in tone, he says, but the tone of his translation here is very different from the tone of the translation of the original, at least in the other versions that I looked at, dealing with the French poem on which that first book was based. The first book has about 80 translations of one poem. Compares them, if you're interested, those of you who haven't read it, the one about the Le Tombeau de Marot. So I think there would be generalizations to be made. You would always be working with a case study, so you have to think, how does your case study relate to some wider issue? And I think one of the wider issues is, to what extent can you say that there is a kind of shared translator personality, or maybe 2 different main types, I don't know. But then would you ask this question of dentists?
Yeah, but I think the dentist's argument is unfair, really. I mean, because it tells you that you're doing something else that you actually do, because you're not interested in dentists because you're interested in dentistry or fillings, or, you know, or the medical procedure behind it, but you're interested in the cultural aspect of dentistry. And I think you can have a legitimately interesting, fascinating study of what dentists do as part of society, or what dentists do on the level of ethics, and how they behave as social agents, how they behave on the economical plane. And these are all the true questions that you ask. But for me, what is interesting and needs reflection perhaps is how important the position of dentists in society is, as opposed to the position of translators, especially if you look at them as creative beings. And you tend to, if you're interested in what they do as not just copyists, but as writers, you're actually interested in the creative side, like, you know, they become artists rather than just copy machines.
You are talking about literary translators, aren't you?
Not necessarily. I don't think so. I think I'm talking about interpreters as well, and I'm talking about every translator who feels, or who has this thought that perhaps they are not just copying, who is self-reflexive, or who is And I think most of them are. Some of them cannot afford to go on with this thinking because they have to make the ends meet. But I think there is always this kind of recognition that there is more to it than just copying.
I think self-reflection is something that literary translators certainly probably engage in, because they tend to be more, I was going to say more introspective. I don't know if that's true actually, than say your medical translator or your comic strip translator or something, I don't know, or your subtitler. I don't know, I just don't know.
Do we have any more questions or comments that you would like to share? If not, then let me thank you once again.
Thank you for your attention. Thank you.